Let's start with our look back at the UK Open. Dimitri van der Bergh beating Luke Humphries 11-10 in Sunday night's final to become a two-time major winner. We previewed the UK Open last week and we discussed if this was going to be the year that the UK Open went back to one of the elite. But is this Dimitri putting himself back amongst that elite group of players with this win?
I think it's too soon to say that, but he certainly has put himself in that next tier of players. And, you mentioned, his second major, you mentioned tips. And if we go back to his first major now, nearly 4 years ago in the middle of lockdown, before we did tip of the year, I half jokingly, but I kept telling Mac, asking him if after Dimmy wins the World Match Play, if we can get him on. And I started saying that a few weeks before the event. And what happened? He went and won it. So I think that's the tip in the show's history, because I had called it just as a joke a couple weeks before, but I did not call Dimitri van der Bergh winning the UK Open. I didn't even have him on my radar. And I don't think I was wrong not to have him on my radar, even if in the end I was wrong to not pick him because he did win, because there was nothing to indicate that this is where his game was going entering into Minehead. You look back at the World Championships, blowing a 2-set lead against Florian Hempel. You look at most of his matches on television after the UK Open last year, as well as a regression in the Euro Tour and the Players Championships. He'd made a clear step backwards over the previous 9 months, if not multiple steps backwards. After, he hadn't reached the heights since winning the World Match Play in 2020 and making the final in 2021. But still, for a good few years, he was in that elite or that second tier. That's why he made it to 2 Premier Leagues. That's why he was in the conversation another time. He wasn't in the conversation this year. He wasn't even in that second tier of the conversation because he had taken those clear steps backwards. And even though he made the semifinals in Milton Keynes at the Masters, he was one of the weakest players that week. He was consistent between 88 and 91 every match, but that is very, very rarely going to make the semifinals of a major. That very rarely will win more than one match, let alone 3. And he was fortunate in that. And he hasn't been lighting up the averages in the Players' Championship events this year. He is 25th in averages, which is fairly good. Obviously, anything top 32 is good. And I think that 25th is a little bit of an understatement because he was very poor the first weekend with an 87 and a 90 average. So since then, he's averaging more like a top 16 level. But top 16, again, is not elite. But he was, if not elite, pretty close to it in Minehead. Outside the match against Johnny Clayton, where he averaged 90, he did in every match that thing that we talked about last year that you need to do in a major. Every match between 93 and in one case 99. And the 93 was in essence a 94. So I should say every match between 94 and nearly 100, with the exception of that Johnny Clayton. Nearly a ton against Brendan Dolan. Nearly 94 against Martin Lukman, who we'll come on to in the next question. 96 and change against Damon Hedda, who we'll also talk about in the next question. And 95 against Luke Humphries in the final. And he did let Luke back in that match. He was 7-2 up. He went off the boil a little bit. Luke upped his game as well and missed a bunch of darts at tops and several different legs that could have kept pulling away. But in the end, he hit when he needed to, and he won it. And he was outside of that match against Johnny Clayton consistently at a match and tournament winning level across the weekend. I'm not going to say he's back to the elite quite yet. There's been too many negatives over the last 9 months to say one title, even if it was an impressive title, puts him back among the elites. But it's at least, after multiple steps backwards, a giant leap forward. And even if it's not, it's still a major title. No one's going to say, well, I would rather not have done that. It was a great weekend for him and a well-needed one to get him back up to world number 7.
Yeah, it certainly was a much-needed win, and it's an interesting question. And you mentioned that first major title that Dimitri van der Bergh won, the World Match Play in 2020. We go back to then, the world was a very different place. The world of darts was as well, and his win kind of opened the floodgates for these new first-time major winners, and that's carried on with the return of crowds and into this year as well. We've seen Stephen Bunting winning the Masters as well, his first major in the PDC. But that one for Dimitri back then, it did feel like a pivotal moment in his career. And if you'd have said back then, the next 3.5 years coming into 2024, he would still be on the same number of majors, you probably would have raised an eyebrow at that statement. And I wouldn't say Dimitri was in the darting doldrums as such heading into this UK Open. He was still inside that top 16. He just made that semi-final of the Masters, although he hadn't played amazingly well. We weren't saying how well he was playing, but no one was talking about him amongst that elite group of players that he'd been in for a while before that. And we spoke about that elite last week, the Premier League players, Gary Anderson, Ryan Searle, the form that they'd shown on the floor events this year. Dimitri's name didn't come up, and the odds for the UK Open a lot higher because of the nature of the event, but 66-1 at the start of the weekend. That shows you that he wasn't someone that people were putting in that conversation to go all the way. And at the weekend, we saw it though, Dimitri Van den Bergh, he has put himself back in that picture. And okay, maybe not at that very top level, but there wasn't the eye-catching 100-plus averages that we regularly see from the likes of Luke Humphreys and Luke Littler. But what we did see from him was that game, and you mentioned it there, that those 90 averages between 93 and 99 for the most part, apart from that one game. That game, and you add in the timing as well of certain shots, it can be very hard to beat. And aside from that, he was operating at a high level. You look at the legs that he won, the 62 legs, 44 of them he won in 15 darts or less, and that gives you that 100 average, 15 darts or less. So you don't have to produce it every single leg to win matches, but we know that to put a run clip of about 70 to 71%, 15 darts or below, is going to make you a very tough nut to crack. And I think the mental strength as well that he showed over the weekend, and we can look to the final, and we could probably spend half an hour talking about the ups and downs in that one match alone, but you also add in the semi-final with Damon Heta overcoming that rocky start to win that game. The early rounds as well, away from the main stage in that multi-board room. He had some battles with Brendan Dolan, Vincent van der Voort. So there's probably been times since the match play where we felt Dimitri Van den Bergh was more likely and closer to that second major title, more so than this past weekend. But it's come now, and it has reminded everyone that on his day, he deserves to be recognised as a contender for these titles. And on his day, he has got the game to go and beat former major winners. And we saw it in the final, beat the world number one and the reigning world champion.